It's my ambition to get this car running by this summer, and in order to do so we're going to have to sort the fuel system out. Now this is a very early 107 SL in 1975 and has the D-Jectronic fuel injection system, which is quite complicated and quite dependent on vacuum and various other things, but we have one or two subscribers on this channel who are experts in those systems, so I'm hoping to be able to call on them. But before we can get this car started, we have to put the fuel system together. At the moment, there's no fuel pump, no accumulators, filters, or any of the hardware on this car. None of the fuel lines are attached, and the fuel tank isn't attached. That's the bad news. The good news is that this car was apparently running. The previous owner sent me a video of it running before I bought it, so we'll just have to see if we can get it crawled underneath this 280 SL to have a look at where the fuel pump setup should be. And it's worth noticing that a lot of new panels on this car. This is the not the battery tray, but the right hand compartment that normally rusts out on these cars. That's a new panel. This here is the spare wheel well, that usually rusts out, or often rusts out, and that's also new on this car. But what we are concerned with is this section here. This is where the fuel pump bracket should be. What I'm interested to see here is what screw holes we've got, because we're going to have to get a new fuel pump bracket, or this bracket for the fuel pump assembly, and I'm interested to know what was on here before. So I can see there are 2, 4, 6, 8, possibly 9 holes up there. So let's have a look at our parts cart and see what's on there. This here is my 1976 280 SL, a left-hand drive, and you can see what often happens on these cars is they rust out here, and they also rust out here, which is obviously what happened to that car. This is the fuel pump assembly on my 1976 280 SL. Now, this on this car has all been renewed. Up in the back here is the fuel accumulator, but this bracket here is slightly different to the one on the parts car. Let's just have a look at that. I thought my 280 SL was rusty. This is the 450 SL parts car, and there's not much left of it. Most of it has rusted away, but we're interested in that fuel pump assembly. You can see that this fuel pump assembly here is a different setup to the 280 SL. Now, one of our subscribers sent me a picture of the fuel pump setup on his 1975 SL, and it looks very similar to this with the fuel pump here. Now these fuel pumps, the older style fuel pumps, actually had the outlet coming from the side of the pump. So this here is the fuel filter, and these are the sort of rubber suspension joints, for want of a better word. And this is the hose coming down from the fuel tank. Now let's just see where the fuel accumulator is, if indeed there is one on this car. It's difficult to see what's behind this shield, but let's just get our impact socket on here and see if we can whip this off, because we're going to need this part for the car that we're doing. There's one more at the back. Is the cover. Now we're probably going to have to reuse that and refurbish it, obviously, and if not, possibly make up a new one. I'm not sure they sell those anymore. It's a crazy arrangement up here. There's some little brackets, etc. When the subscriber sent me a picture of his car, I just assumed there were loads of bits missing because it looked so weird, but I can't see any sign of any fuel accumulator on this car, so we're going to try and take all these brackets off and see what we're left with. Go any further, I'm going to actually check that the fuel tank has been drained on this car. I suspect it hasn't, so we're just going to disconnect that lower fuel hose and drain any fuel that's still in this car. Maybe it has been drained. Oops. I don't know what all of that is. Maybe that's just fuel in the... well, gosh. Maybe that's just old fuel in the fuel pump and the accumulator. I'm going to just cut some of these hoses. Next up, I'm just undoing the electrical connections. There's a small nut and one of these lock washers on there. Now that we've got the electrical wires off, they're two different size nuts, a 7 and an 8. But now we've got those off, we should just be able to cut this fitting here, and that should drop right down. Let's have a look. There we go. I've got that free. We finally got that fuel pump bracket off the car. It's quite an unusual setup. You can see the actual outlet from the fuel pump is on the side here, and there are two. This is the fuel filter, I'm assuming, and there's no fuel accumulator. All of these bits here are still available, and we'll be replacing and refurbishing this entire bracket. But the first thing you have to do is get this screw here out, and in order to do that I think we have to try and separate the fuel filter and the fuel pump. So let's see if we can do that. I'm going to have to cut these fittings off here with an angle grinder. I'm slightly loath to do it because of sparks and petrol. Brackets, sent it off to the powder coaters and ordered all these stainless steel bolts and fittings that we're going to need to reassemble it, and just waiting for those to arrive. Now while they do, I need to decide what to do with this cover. On the older SLs, those covers were metal, and on the newer SLs, the covers are plastic. They're no longer available, so I need to decide whether to make another one myself or try and refurbish this one. Now this is the fuel pump assembly cover from my 1976 280 SL, and it is different from the earlier SLs in two respects. First of all, it's made out of plastic, and secondly, it's bigger to accommodate the newer style fuel pumps, which were longer. They had the inlet and the outlet at the end, as opposed to the older style fuel pumps, which had the valve coming out the side of here. The good news is that these holes here do actually line up with the old style holes, so this will fit on a 1975 SL. And what we may try and do is just procure a second-hand one. There's a couple of people in the UK that have them, but they want about £50 to £75 plus postage for them, which seems a wee bit expensive. Doing a job, you should hope for the best and expect the worst. And a case in point is this little fitting here that we've just ordered from the SL shop. It's just come. This screws into, or should screw into, the fuel filter. Now this is the old one that came out, and it screws into the fuel filter no problem at all. The new one screws into the filter about this far and then starts to bind really tight, and I don't know if it just needs to be tightened up with a spanner or whether the thread size is wrong or the threads are crossed. What I don't want to do is risk knackering this expensive fuel filter, so what I'm going to do is see if I can get the new fitting into the old filter. That will potentially clear up the threads on here if that's the problem, and if the problem is that this part is actually knackered because the threads are wrong or whatever, then we'll end up knackering this old filter and this, but this wouldn't be any good to us anyway, and we can, at worst case scenario, just use the old fitting, clean it up a little bit. So I'm going to hold the filter with a 20mm spanner, and I'm going to turn this in, or wind this in, with a 19mm socket. I can feel this getting tight already. It was really tight, but that did actually go in there. So basically the problem was just those new threads were not quite cut correctly, or possibly whatever coating they've put on there got in the way of the thread. So I'm confident we can now put this in with the crush washer. There's the crush washer there, and there's the part number there that from the SL shop. This is no longer available from Mercedes, this part. As I say, this style of fitting here only really happened on the older style fuel filters. New filter is actually a 22mm socket on the bottom and a 19mm on the top. So if you do get a new filter and this fitting is really tight, don't be surprised. These are the pulsation dampeners which appear on the earlier 107 SLs. Now this is the one here off our parts car, and you can see it's really rusty, and I'm going to cut that open to see what's inside it. Okay, moment of truth. Let's see what's inside here. First time ever on YouTube, and it looks like there's absolutely nothing inside there at all apart from rust. Would you believe it? I'm sure I would have thought there'd have been a diaphragm or something inside there, but no, there is nothing inside there. Transpires there should indeed be a diaphragm inside one of these pulsation dampeners, and the job of this dampener here is basically to damp out the ripples that you get in the petrol from the injectors opening and closing, a little bit like if you put a big beach ball in a swimming pool underneath the water and then let it bounce to the top, you'd get a ring of waves, and that could potentially cause the car to stutter and all sorts of things like that. This bracket looked beyond hope when we took it off the parts car, but it's come back from the powder coaters. They've done a really nice job, and this should be good for the next 50 years. All the other parts have arrived from our various suppliers. We've got new dampers here from Mercedes, new fittings here from the SL shop, new fuel filter from Parts in Motion. We are actually still waiting for the pulsation damper from Germany. We've got the fuel strainers, the lines coming down from the fuel tank, the stainless steel hose clips from Westfield Fasteners, but we do have a major problem. And that is because on later SLs, they changed the fuel pump to this style here, and this style of fuel pump has a wider fitting here, so it no longer fits the fuel pipe gauge. So the pulsation dampener, now these little parts here are extremely expensive. Mercedes wants something like £288 for this part here, so we've sourced one from Germany from a company called SLS that hopefully is going to come via my brother that lives in Germany, and they cost about 100 euros by the time you've got postage. But you can see that the fittings here are a different size, so I'm not quite sure how we're going to get around that problem. Now, in addition to that, there is a pipe that basically leads from the fuel tank down to that pulsation dampener, but once again, this is a completely different size. This size of fitting is designed to fit that, so this is what came from Mercedes from the diagram, but what we actually need, this is what came off the car originally, and this is the fuel pump strainer here. There's a new one from Mercedes, and this fitting here, which is rusted solid in there, actually has the correct gauge on there, so we may have to try and source one of those fittings, take a piece of pipe from the dampener down to there. That would sort that problem out, but that still leaves us with the issue of how we're going to join the pulsation dampener to the fuel pump. I suppose what we could do is try and refurbish the fuel pump from our gold parts car, because that's the original style of fuel pump and it'll have the right fitting on it, or we may have to go along to some kind of hose shop and see if somehow you can modify the hoses both there and here to see if we can get around that point. In fact, that was rusted in there solid. Our good old DeWalt impact wrench driver got that out for us, so we may be able to use this, which may help us. So we're back at Pertec, and they helped us out with the Fiat 238. They have in the first instance cleaned this up for us here, so that is going to help us sort out the fuel tank to the pulsation dampener. They just ordered us a little fitting which is going to step us down from the fuel pump here to this here. They don't keep these in stock, but they'll have them tomorrow. And best of all, they also keep some of these braided fuel hoses in stock, so they've pretty much sorted us out again. It's the next day, and this fuel pump bracket assembly is slowly but surely coming together. This is the little step-down part that Pertec have ordered for us. It's only a couple of pounds. They've also given us an off-cut piece of hose, the correct size, so we are now able to step a new style fuel pump down to the standard Mercedes hose for this pulsation dampener. Ordered some 22mm hose clips, stainless steel hose clips from Westfield Fasteners, which will attach there, and also some standard 16 to 18mm hose clips, which will attach to the standard Mercedes pipe. This section here, this screws into the fuel tank, and this screws directly into there, and we'll just be able to use the standard Mercedes hose to attach the pulsation dampener. Only slight problem is this is quite a long fitting here, so this is off the parts car, and this is about the correct length of hose, and you can see that by the time we've put that long fitting in, there's hardly any hose left or gaps left, which means there would not be much flexibility in this. Now, we could just cut 1 centimetre off the end and just have that inserted in there like that. That will work. or we can just look at the fuel pump off the parts car, the rusty old fuel pump, and maybe refurbish that and see if it still works. So using our trusty impact wrench again, I'm going to see if I can actually use a screwdriver bit on the end of there to undo any of these totally rusted screws. Highly unlikely, but we'll give it a great hot go. Right. Well, that is one down. That, wow, so look at that. That actually snapped the head off, which is not surprising. Would you believe, with the help of a wrench and a hacksaw, just to get a little bit deeper in there, we actually managed to get that off. Now we've just got one snapped screw in there, which I'm hoping I can get a set of more grips on. Let's have a look inside here. I've seen the inside of one of these pumps before. Quite sure how they work, but we'll take this one to pieces and see if we can figure it out. The style of fuel pump is known as a positive displacement roller vane pump, and it gets its name from this vane that's inside it. And these little rollers here come out, but you'll notice when I put this little piece back on that it is not centered. I thought when I first took it to pieces that it was damaged in some way, but that's actually the way the pump is designed. As this shaft spins, these little rollers are thrown out, and it creates a vacuum because by virtue of the fact that this is closer to the edge than here. The fuel gets trapped in these little sections here and then is drawn. That vacuum draws the fuel through this channel here from the fuel tank via the pulsation dampener. And it is crucially important that when you take this to pieces, that these pieces all go on exactly as they came off, because the thickness of this piece here, it's not a uniform thickness all the way around, which is how that that offset is created. So when you first take it off, your pump may look like this, and you'll have these rubber seals and the markings on there to guide you. But once you've cleaned all of that rust and dirt off, this will just be a polished bit of metal. So it has this notch here. So make a note of how that notch lines up. On this particular pump, the notch is almost aligned with that bottom tube, and it's just offset slightly. And similarly, crucially important that this piece goes on in exactly the same orientation that it came off. As with most of the Mercedes fuel pumps, the positive terminal has a slightly thicker thread than the negative terminal, so you can always differentiate the two. On this particular pump here, the motor inside this casing here is actually immersed in petrol. So the petrol surrounds the motor as it flows out, and the reason that the whole thing doesn't short out is because in actual fact hydrocarbon fuel petrol is not that conductive. It doesn't conduct electricity very well, at least not well enough to short the connections out. The fuel also has the effect of keeping the motor cool as well. And the other thing that you may think is, well, what happens if you had a spark inside there as the brushes touching the motor? Well, you would have the wrong mixture to ignite. That would be almost 100% fuel in there, and it is encased, so there shouldn't be any air in there. But for fuel and air to ignite, you need a 14:1 air to fuel mixture. So that's why that whole system works. It's worth pointing out, if you ever take your pump off and you plan to clean it or do anything crazy, don't ever try pumping water through this, because obviously that would short the terminals out and ruin your pump. And similarly, you shouldn't run these pumps dry. If you're going to clean it, just run petrol through it and clean the outside of it as best you can. A big difference between this old style pump here and the new ones is that the inlet here is the same gauge as the pulsation dampener. So therefore you can use the standard Mercedes fuel hose. On the newer pumps, you'll notice that it's a much wider gauge. Now, in order to refurbish this pump properly, we're going to have to take out this fitting and replace the copper seal washout, but that looks totally rusted in there, that fitting, and I suspect we'd probably have to get a whole new fitting made up because that nut there just looks way too corroded. Just before we get too far involved in cleaning this pump up, let's actually see whether it works or not. This is a 8-volt battery, a little Fish Technique battery. This switch here, when I press it, will put power to the terminals. And let's see what happens. So that pump works absolutely fine. In fact, it runs really smoothly considering it hasn't run for 20 years. So we're going to set about cleaning this pump, and we may use this pump on the 280SL, the 1975 280SL restoration, simply because it's going to make our life a million times easier having the right gauge tube fittings on the actual pump. I'm going to leave this video here. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to take out the fuel tank from a 107 SL. We should also by then have refurbished and cleaned this fuel pump. That'll allow us to attach the fuel pump assembly to the fuel tank. Just arrived in the post a minute ago is a package from Euro, which I'm hoping has got the correct fuel sender in it, and also a transmission pan gasket for our SL55, because we're going to be changing the conductor plate on that car. So once we have got all of this fuel pump assembly and fuel tank hooked up to the fuel lines, we will be one major step closer to getting that 1975 280SL running. These little rubber buffers are common to all 107 SLs, and I think the Pagoda too. We got them from Mercedes. That's the part number there, 12698800011. Total, including VAT, £17.17. This little fitting here is unique to the older SLs. We got ours from the SL shop. There's the part number there, 107 470 0279. Costs us £8.65. You'll need a little seal ring on there as well. That's the part number there, 99p, plus of course there's the postage. We got all the hardware for this fuel pump assembly from Westfield Fasteners. They have got everything from the bolts that you're going to need here, the stainless steel nuts and washers, and these specialist hose clamps here. These are special fuel hose clamps, and they're very close to the OEM Mercedes ones. You're going to need 3 sizes of these hose clamps. You're going to need the smaller size from the header tank to the fuel tank. Then you're going to need another size 14 to 16 here for the pump to the filter, and then you need a slightly larger diameter for the fuel pump to the pulsation dampener, and from the pulsation dampener up to the fuel tank. We got the correct fuel filter from eBay from these guys here, Car Parts in Motion, cost us £17.86. In my experience, these guys here are cheaper than anyone else, and they deliver in super quick time, and that's the part number up there. Hold the fuel pump assembly to the chassis of the car. We got those from Amazon, number 14 or 6.3mm times 13mm hex head self-tapping. Once again, we got stainless steel ones to make sure they don't rust in the future. Pack of 20, £6.34 delivered. You need 3 different types of fuel hose for this assembly. The fuel hose that attaches to the pulsation dampener is this stuff here, which comes from Mercedes. That's the size of it, 11.5 internal by 17.5, and the Mercedes part number there is 112476. 1226. That's about £10.40 for a metre of that. Pertec, who supplied this step down piece for us, also sell various braided hose. So the hose that runs between the fuel filter and the fuel pump is a different gauge hose again. That hose has a 14mm outer diameter and an internal diameter of 7mm. Tempted to compromise when it comes to buying fuel hose. Good fuel hose will have a date on it when it expires, and it'll also be a special hose that's resistant to ethanol-based fuels and petroleum. Don't be tempted to use heater hose or any other hose that isn't clearly labelled as fuel hose. Not least, the pulsation dampener, €94. Quite difficult to get hold of and very expensive in the UK. We got from these guys here in Germany, SLS, that's their web address there. They've got just about everything you need for classic Mercedes.